So I've talked already about the cycles of technology and demographics and debt and how they cause a general deflationary spiral. I mean, how do we know this? How do we know that this is a problem and exactly how it occurs? Well, because we have a very good example. And the example is, of course, Japan, starting about 30 years ago in 1990. Japan has gone nowhere. And Japan has these three problems in an extreme example. Now, Japan is a technology driven society. We know that. It has transformed their nation and, well, made work very difficult for a lot of people. They also have an extreme demographic issue where the population is aging very rapidly. But most importantly, Japan has a tremendous amount of debt, about twice as much government debt as the United States at this point, compared to their economy. And before, if you remember, I talked about, we have the Friedman example, keeping the money supply constant, making sure there's plenty of yen out there to reflate things. Or we have the Keynesian concept of increasing demand for goods. Which one is going to work to get Japan out of its problem? Well, they've tried both. Nothing has happened. Nothing has fixed Japan. All they have is a tremendous amount of debt and a technology driven society that's only getting older. 30 years of stagnation. It's considered the example all around the world because, well, they were the original developing nation, weren't they? They set the standard for the Asian tigers and everybody else. And this is where it goes. Yes, this could be where it goes. You see, when you take out too much debt, borrowing money from tomorrow, moving it into today, what if tomorrow never comes? Or for that matter, what if tomorrow doesn't provide jobs? The simple answer is that monetary policy and stimulus clearly do not provide a way out. So the question becomes, what does? Now, I said I wasn't going to get too much into solutions, and I don't want to get too much into solutions right now, but there's obviously one that I'm going to be talking about. Something dramatic has to happen. And it starts with, well, what the problem with the debt spiral is, which is that you've increased your overhead. When you have a debt payment that you have to make every month, you have a nut. You have a certain amount that you have to make every month just to get through that debt. And that makes it all much more difficult. It's all about keeping your overhead low, keeping it loose and flexible, like that flexible workforce that comes with a project-based system that is our contractors. I mean, clearly this has advantages for employers and some employees alike. It's taking up a quarter of our workforce. That is an interesting situation that's only going to keep growing. What do we do to make that happen? We have to keep the overhead low. We have to keep the debt low. And frankly, we have to keep the taxes low. I mean, there's an old adage among conservatives, if you tax something, you have less of it. This is absolutely true. If you look at supply and demand, you tax something, you make it more expensive, you're going to have, what, less of it. Very simple. And this may be a desirable effect. For example, if you tax pollution, mazel tov, it's all working. In the case of Japan, there are all kinds of tax incentives that were messed up. And they have issues all over the place. And now with all of the debt, they have just a tremendous overhead they can't go anywhere with. How do we break out of that? Well, one of the areas that I like to start in is an analysis of that basic social contract. Right now, you might be working from home or not working. And this is one of the big issues in the United States and around the world really is restarting the economy so that people all have jobs when this is over. That's the idea of stimulus checks and all of this other printing of money, printing of debt. But there must be another way. There must be something more dramatic. And I'd simply like to now point out a situation with employment that nobody ever seems to think about, and that is the high overhead per employee, the high amount of taxation that is put on employees. I mean, for example, You might make about $24 an hour or pretty close to 50 grand a year. That's the median American wage right now. And you might say to yourself, I cost 50 grand a year and I need to deliver 50 grand worth of value to my employer. I hope you think that way. I mean, we should all take pride in our work. Here's the thing. There are all these taxes that are put on top of employment. We have the employer's contribution of FICA at 7.62%. We have workers' comp. We have unemployment insurance. And the big one of all, we stick employers with a bill for health care. Okay? And we know that employers do their best to get out of that or minimize it, but in the end, what is that net overhead per employee? The answer is that for many companies, like General Motors uses a figure of double the salary, double the wages, because they have a good package of benefits. A small business might get away with as much as 40%, or as little as 40% of the salary, but it's 40 to 100% depending on how things are set up. And of course, a lower wage worker that still has to be covered for health insurance, I mean, that's a bigger percentage of the bill. So if you're making 50 grand a year, you actually cost between 70 and 100 grand a year, depending on your employer situation, right? If you tax something, you have less of it. And boy, do we tax employment. Now, this may seem to make sense, and it certainly did when all of these systems were set up way back in the New Deal in the 1930s and 40s. Okay? That's when healthcare started to become something that was provided by employers. When there was a wage freeze and they couldn't do anything to bump up wages for valued workers, they gave them more bennies. And there was upward pressure on bennies because it couldn't be on wages. But also by law, we have a situation, well, the employer has to make a contribution to your retirement fund, essentially. That's what Social Security is, the FICA. And workers' comp, well, if it's a more dangerous place, you want that to be a larger tax on the employer, and so it's adjusted. The same for unemployment insurance. Many of these workers who go from one contract to the next wind up with a little stint of unemployment in the middle. If the employer hires a lot of contract people and they file a lot of unemployment, that number should go up, shouldn't it? Right? It seems to make sense. But we wind up with this high burden per employee, and especially with the case of healthcare. One of the problems with technology is that it simply replaces workers. I mean, auto factories employ only a few thousand people these days. People who used to just shuffle paper around all over the place now are replaced by computers. There is a net shortage of jobs, and this has been very well known. Well, Kurt Vonnegut's first novel, Player Piano, in 1953, addressed this very topic. This was published 3 years before Steve Jobs was born. Yes, it's true. Technology is a double-edged sword. It makes people more productive, and more productive simply can mean job loss if there's only so much work to go around. And for a fixed labor pool, if there's only so much stuff, well then, that's what happens. Everything is fixed. So, what do we do to break out of it? Mostly, it's about reducing overhead. Whatever we can do to reduce the overhead per employee. Now, granted, it may seem to make sense that workers' comp and unemployment insurance and retirement funds and all of these things come out of the employee's package, or they're added on by the employer. But if we go to a system that taxes profits more than employment, we might be able to reduce that. That makes every single worker cheaper. It's sort of like, well, if you want to increase the minimum wage, for example, we want to have more people who are working in a situation. We can reduce the cost without seeing any change to workers if we really focus on that as a concept. And that is a way out of this Japan situation. Because what it comes down to is that technology does indeed eliminate jobs gradually with time. It's the double-edged sword. Productivity gains only mean that somebody is going to be fired unless there is more work to go around, constant growth of some kind. And you can try to reflate things or try to maintain the money supply as Japan tried to do, but you only increase debt. That only increases the overhead. Where can we decrease overhead in a way that puts money directly into the hands of people, increases the amount of money that's circulating around, increases the demand for goods and all that? It's both Keynesian, it's both Friedmanite. Well, this is what it comes down to. Japan tells us what happens if you don't tackle the deflationary cycles quickly. 30 years of stagnation, a lost generation. And it's not getting any better. During all of that time, they had no children. The birth rate is incredibly low in Japan, and the demographic problem is only getting worse. Japan is only getting older. The nation is essentially dying. This bill was printed at a time when, well, it looked like this was only a temporary problem, but we know it's not. And we know it's something that could hit every single developed nation all around the world. It's certainly happening in Europe right now, and it could happen in the United States. We need to do something dramatic. The problem is the overhead. And one area where we have a surprisingly high overhead, if you look at it, is in employment. What can we do to reduce the overhead per employee? I'm going to offer it as a question. I know that these systems are set up for very good reasons. Those employers who are going more and more to contract workers are going to indeed have those workers wind up withdrawing more unemployment insurance in between the gigs. That is certainly going to happen. So increasing that might discourage contract work, okay? But if a flexible workforce is desirable for employers and employees alike, and we can see that this is where things are going, our whole concept of employment law, employment tax, employment incentives needs to be looked at very seriously. And even without considering the change in that, we need to look at how we tax, how we get the money we need to provide these things. Moving to a system that taxes profit rather than employment would change things dramatically. And if you tax something less, well, ideally you have more of it. We can hope. But this gets us around a lot of the different problems. What is the overhead per employee? If you were an employer, tell me what kind of overhead you wind up with. I mean, leaving aside things like training and workspace and all of that kind of stuff, just that monthly, every single paycheck kind of thing that you have to contribute. It's a big number. And the system might seem to make sense, but in the end, does it make sense? Japan shows us what happens if you don't tackle the basic overhead problem. You die. We know what goes on. We know that money supply, fiscal policy doesn't really change a thing. We know that increasing demand doesn't change a thing. Something else has to be done. We can be sure of that. Thank you.